Dear friends, welcome. This time we are talking with a philosopher, a real philosopher from Slovenia. And we are going to talk about the philosophy of education and why teaching is important. Marko, welcome. Welcome to Refill 100. Thank you so much for sharing with us your vision about philosophy, your knowledge about it, as well as your passion for it. So let us start. What is the value of philosophy today, according to Marko Stempihar?
Well, Jesus, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you and to be able to present some of my ideas that I've been working on theoretically, but also coming from my teaching practice. So this question of value of philosophy and teaching philosophy is also quite practical for me. So it is what I do for my living professionally, but also there's a huge personal investment in this. So I firmly believe that this question should be asked, because what we can observe today, in my view, are certain tendencies to understand philosophy in a way that is not necessarily committed to philosophy as such. So to the question, what is the value of philosophy, I would also add question, why do we need philosophy today? So besides being scientifically trained, what is the specific aspect of philosophy? What can philosophy offer us that any other subjects cannot do? So I would say that there's a certain tendency today to understand philosophy in the way of helping us to develop our argumentative skills, our critical thinking skills. So in other words, philosophy, many times today, the value of it, the meaning of it, tends to be kind of instrumentalized. Philosophy is meant as a tool to achieve something, some kind of goal, could be intellectual goal, or also in the broader sense to make us better in our professional lives. But this goal is set outside of philosophy. So philosophy is a kind of what helps us to achieve that goal. That's the instrumental way how philosophy is understood. Then there's another way how we can understand philosophy and its value. And I think here, this is where my personal interest also as a philosophy teacher lies, namely that philosophy does encourage us and helps us to develop us ourselves as critical thinkers, but not critical thinking here is meant in the broader sense. So not just critical thinking as one of the competencies or one of the skills, but it's forming critical consciousness or forming a certain attitude because of which we develop a new perspective in life. So in classical definition, philosophy becomes a way of thinking, and way of thinking becomes a way of living. So this is the division. And the second meaning of philosophy is the one which I take special interest in.
Quite interesting. So this critical thinking, this way of thinking, when it comes to helping young people to be formed, when it comes to yourself to be formed as a citizen, as a human being, and the different roles that you play in society and in your personal life, how do you see the growth of this critical thinking? How is it that you're trying to instill it in your students as well as in yourself?
Well, I think that first thing, or the first challenge that we meet when we try to teach our students philosophy is that the first challenge itself is how to define philosophy, because students are used to having a definition of an area or a discipline which they study at school, whereas in philosophy there is no one definition. And even when we give them certain definitions or certain ways how philosophers thought about philosophy, it seems that this definition is not adequate enough, that it's doing philosophy itself that needs to be practiced for a while in order to get the proper idea of what philosophy is. So I would say that the way how we can work our ways into philosophy is in the same way how ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle defined virtues and developing virtues. So virtues do not develop simply by reading theoretical treatises, by reading philosophy works, but also practicing what we learned. So I would say that's encouraging students to think about philosophy as something very practical, as something that exists all over the place in the world that we encounter. There are all sorts of philosophical questions, or questions that could be approached in a philosophical way, could be deepened in this way. This is where this connection between philosophy and life gets established. So through teaching philosophy, we try to encourage students to connect these sometimes very abstract and speculative ideas with their life, to see that every philosopher was concerned with questions which concern all of us, and there are questions about ourselves.
Okay. Philosophy as a form of life. Philosophy as a way of living. In the daily life of yourself, in the daily life of people, how would you see that works? Mm-hmm. In the concrete? Because obviously in the classroom, at the university, in the libraries, indeed we hear about philosophy. In the cafes we discuss things at the philosophical level and such. But in daily life, how do you see that happening?
Well, Jesus, as you also know, is a philosopher, and probably many of our viewers also know this. It's a common knowledge that philosophy started in ancient Greece with Socrates as a thing that exists in a community. So it's an activity which is not the activity of one individual, but it's part of the communal life. So I think that where philosophy meets its purpose is when it doesn't just become part of our individual lives, but it becomes part of our lives in a community, so as a wider social environment. So I think that philosophers should be critical thinkers who express their ideas, pose their questions, present their critical perspectives. They have to do it publicly. So philosophy has to live as a public discourse, and that this is where I see the importance of it. It's not that philosophy should somehow be adapted to the trends of modern societies or something like that. It should always have a certain critical distance to it, but it also has to be aware not to lose connection between philosophy and between the community, between philosophers as being professionally trained to do philosophy, and people who are not trained as philosophers, but for whom philosophical questions might also have a certain relevance. And for every person at certain stage of life, some philosophical questions become highly relevant.
Okay, thank you, Marko. I see myself the challenge of many scientists, as well as of many philosophers, is how could philosophers philosophize in light of contemporary discoveries, in light of contemporary scientific theories. On the other hand, I also feel the opposite, that oftentimes the scientist can be a very good scientist, but oftentimes his or her philosophical perspectives are very limited, very reduced. And then you end up with a kind of scientific materialism and even a kind of scientific fundamentalism. Would you say that we as people interested in philosophy should also be far more eager to learn about science in a broader kind of way, where we could create also more holistic perspectives rather than specialized ones.
Definitely. I think that science has contributed a major part of our knowledge to us. So without science, without knowing at least some basic findings of science, of course, not all of us can be specialized in scientific fields, but I think that in this sense, I tend to agree with a rather shocking statement made by the late Stephen Hawking, who in one of his books decidedly wrote, philosophy is dead. And his argument for that, I don't agree that philosophy is dead, philosophy is very much alive, but his observation was that many philosophers today don't feel the need to be educated in science anymore, so that there is a lack of knowledge on the part of philosophers about science. But what I missed in Hawking's observation was also the opposite observation that's also probably could be made, which is that many scientists are no longer interested in philosophy. So what I would propose is not any kind of hierarchy between science and philosophy, which is more important, but I would say that both of them are crucial for our understanding of the world and also for our acting in the world, and they should implement each other, that there are certain questions that scientists cannot address within their realm of expertise. And there are certain findings that philosophers have to know in order to approach philosophical questions in a more adequate way. So I am for complementary work of scientists and philosophers. I find this today to be perhaps even more critical than a couple of decades ago because of the technological advancements, because of the ethical questions that new scientific discoveries bring. And without this cooperation, I truly cannot imagine any progress in the future of the human mind.
Very good. Now, in terms of the students that we have, that in a sense are a treasure for us, and that we need to be careful of the way that we craft or help them to craft their personalities and their ways of thinking while we have them in the classroom. What would you gain from, let's say, pedagogical thinkers such as Paulo Freire and that kind of critical thinking that allows students to grow from within rather than from receiving that kind of accumulation of information that we receive today, and they are very much exposed to all the media and such. The critical thinking in the pedagogy of Paulo Freire, how do you see that working?
Well, thank you for this question. I am now currently working on a thesis which is dedicated to that connection between teaching, and in my case specifically teaching philosophy and critical pedagogy, starting with Paulo Freire and his work in that field. And I think that one of the main teachings of Paulo Freire is that there is a certain aspect of our work that's often not being very much acknowledged and understood by the pedagogues themselves, namely that every act of teaching is a political act, so that when we teach, we influence our students in many ways, and these ways could go into direction of empowering them to be more autonomous and critical citizens, what Freire called a conscientization, so raising consciousness to the level in which we can understand our social embeddedness and also our possibilities to act. On the other hand, education could also be the opposite. This is what Freire called the banking education, where we treat our students as deposits, as banks where we lay deposits of knowledge, and then this is the way how Freire would say this is the way how oppression works. So making students into instruments of in the vast net of power, where their capacities to act autonomously are critically diminished. So Freire was convinced that education should be emancipatory, that we have to work as pedagogues to contribute to students' emancipation, meaning that students become subjects in the world, being capable of autonomous action, making their own choices, how they would like to live, and have a real influence on the society, the part of which they are. So it's also education for critical consciousness, but it's also education for living a democratic life. And I think that also philosophy teachers should be aware of this dimension of what they do, that philosophy itself, it has many sub-areas, but this political aspect is not necessarily grasped in all areas. One case which is so obviously challenging for philosophers is the case of a philosopher who was engaged in a political sense for the wrong cause. I'm talking about Martin Heidegger, who as a philosopher was highly developed his ideas in a very complex way in a certain area, but in other areas, like politically, he was unaware of the consequences of the choices that he made. So I think critical pedagogy emphasizes that every individual should be aware of this political dimension of what we do, what we say, how we act with others.
Okay. Well, in this context, I wonder from your experience, coming from a part of the world which I do not know, unfortunately, but which has a long history in terms of politics, in terms of human commitment, in terms of education. How would you see our current education? That is to say, is our current education being enriched with technology, truly enriched? It's not becoming, let's say, more individualistic, and in that sense, wouldn't the philosophy that we want to promote will be more a kind of community-oriented philosophy? How you see that kind of dilemma that we have between individualism and in a sense of community, in line with Paulo Freire, but also in line with the thinking that we have today in terms of being practical, pragmatic, and meritocratic society?
Well, Jesus, I would say that, and here I would now refer to one of the follower and student of Paulo Freire, Peter McLaren, Canadian philosopher of education, and his idea that schools are places where a certain conflict happen today. So classical Marxist notion of school is going also to the formulation of Louis Althusser, who said that schools are ideological apparatuses of the state. So classical Marxist notion might be that schools are here for social reproduction of the class struggle. So they are a kind of sites where ideology is promoted and where students are mostly indoctrinated to believe in the prevalent ideas, which are, according to Marx, the ideas of the upper class, the dominant class, that these ideas are true. Now, McLaren, also as a Marxist philosopher, criticized this approach. He said, well, this is too one-sided. Schools are not just these institutions of indoctrination. There's a conflict in schools between the Enlightenment task of school to make people educated in the sense of having more access to knowledge, being more critically oriented, being more autonomous in this sense. That's this enlightenment, humanistic side of education. But on the other hand, in the neoliberal world, education is also used for corporate interests. So there's a conflict in schools between the two tendencies. On the one hand, we have the idea of education as a public good, as a public service, building community, making people more knowledgeable, therefore more empowered to make meaningful decisions about their lives. On the other hand, we have the corporate logic, which individualizes the community, the school community, so emphasizes individual success, aims for scores, tries to aim for higher scores, and doesn't take into account the complexity of schooling. So I think today we are somehow all over the world, also in our country and probably in many other countries, we are facing this as a result of globalization, that there's a certain tendency to privatize the public sphere, or what Marx called the commons. And education is an important part of the commons. It's a huge resource which the capital needs to implement itself further. But in this way, this classical notion and ideals get lost. So I think that it's worthy today to have this in mind and to not to forget about this core humanistic task of education that is being under threat with this other logic, which doesn't care much about anything else, but it's the domain of what's profitable.
Okay, well, this leads me to another question, perhaps the last big question, then we will have to start thinking about concluding our short interview. But the idea is this, coming from a country where you speak another language than the language that we are using now, and me myself speaking also another language that is not the language that I'm speaking now, I have always had some difficulties about the prevalence of the English language in the literature and education of today. And very often I wonder, okay, what is the vision of the French-speaking person vis-a-vis the vision of the English-speaking person? When I listen to the news, I listen to the news in different languages precisely to try to understand what is the thinking, the framework of these different people. And I find it amazing all the time when I listen to the news in Spanish or I read some literature in Spanish, and then I compare it to what I read in English. And very often, of course, they don't match at all. They are so different. And in that sense, I would say, how do you feel about that? Is your interpretation of philosophy in your language comparable to other interpretations that you read in other languages, specifically in English or in other languages that you may also research on?
Well, I think we have, for philosophers, things are complicated in at least double sense. One of them is the problem that you mentioned. So we find ourselves in a foreign language, and philosophy itself comes as a translation from language that majority of us don't master anymore, and that's ancient Greek or classical Latin and so on and so forth. So there's already a translation. Then many times we teach in programs where we speak language which again is not our own language. So that's definitely an important aspect of what we could call as a kind of alienation from what our common sense is used to. Then the further problem, the further complication comes since I understand philosophy, philosophical discourse itself as a kind of foreign language. So what do I mean by this? With this, I mean that when we start to develop philosophical ideas, many times they are something that we are not used to thinking like that in our ordinary discourse. So for many of our students, philosophy itself might be a kind of foreign language. So something that comes from somewhere else of what we are used to. So, but the point here is not to try to adapt philosophy, and that's the further challenge, to the common sense, but to try to change the way how we think in order to adapt ourselves to philosophy. So this, what I could call, relating to Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida, perhaps the most, this alterity, something, this otherness that cannot be translated into something of our own, has a double function, I would say. It's a challenge at the beginning, but on the other hand, as Derrida has taught us, this is the only place where we can truly learn. So encountering something that's not our own, that is not ourselves, this is where learning starts. So it's a challenge and opportunity at the same time, I would say.
Okay, well, quite interesting. Because we are about to close our interview, one last short question that can be also as an invitation. Are you going to invite people, our audience, to philosophize, our students to do philosophy in the classroom and in their daily lives, because philosophy makes the world better? Is that your conviction, that indeed philosophy needs to be promoted because philosophy helps the world to be a better place? Is that the case, Marko?
Yes, it's an excellent question. I believe so. I think that thinking philosophically does importantly contribute to making the world a better place, but it's a metaphor if I put it in this way, because philosophy doesn't do anything on its own. People change the world. So here I would go very much along this line of argumentation that was proposed by another Slovene philosopher recently, Slavoj Žižek, relating to Marx's famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach's philosophy, which is philosophers until now have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. Žižek proposed a reversal. He said, we did too many things, especially in the last century, in the 20th century, to try to change the world. Now is the time to stop and reflect. And the point of this is that only on the basis of a deep reflection, on the basis of deep philosophical thinking, we can make better and more mindful decisions. So I think philosophy has an important role here, but the final decision has to come from us, and hopefully philosophically educated people can make better, wiser decisions, and in this case, they can truly make the world a better place.
Very good. Well, Marko, we thank you very, very much for your reflections. Dear friends, I thank you very, very much for your time, for listening to us, and we invite you to continue watching our videos. We invite you to subscribe if you haven't done so, as well as to invite your friends, your relatives to register, to inscribe also to Refill 100. As always, we wish you all the best. Have a great rest of this day. Have a great philosophical day. Have a great philosophical life. See you next time.
Thank you. Goodbye.